The morning light filtered through the dusty curtains of the old Victorian house, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floors. In the corner of what used to be the family dining room, Harold sat quietly in his threadbare armchair, watching the world wake up outside his window. At 78 years old, his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his reading glasses, but his eyes remained sharp, observing everything with the patience that only comes with age. The house had been his sanctuary for over 40 years. Every creaking board, every faded photograph on the mantel, every chip in the paint told a story of a life well lived. But now, as he listened to the hushed arguments coming from the kitchen, Harold understood that his children saw this place and him very differently than he did. "I can't keep doing this alone," came the strained voice of his daughter Margaret from the next room. Her words cut through the morning silence like a blade. "The medication alone costs $300 a month, and that's not even counting the doctor visits." Harold's son Robert cleared his throat, the sound heavy with irritation. "Don't look at me. I already pay for his groceries and that physical therapy nonsense. Maybe it's time we started looking at other options." The way he said "other options" made Harold's chest tighten with a familiar ache. Patricia, Robert's wife, joined the conversation with her characteristic bluntness. "Other options? You mean like admitting what we're all thinking? He's become a financial burden we can't afford anymore." Her voice carried no warmth, no recognition that the man she was discussing had given Robert life, had worked double shifts to put him through college, had walked him down the aisle at his wedding. The kitchen fell silent for a moment, and Harold could almost feel the weight of their shared guilt pressing against the walls. But guilt, he had learned, was often weaker than resentment, especially when money was involved. Margaret broke the silence with a sigh that seemed to echo through the entire house. "Look, I love Dad. We all do. But love doesn't pay bills. His social security barely covers utilities, and we're all struggling with our own expenses. The kids need new school clothes, the mortgage is behind, and now we're supposed to stretch our budgets even thinner." Harold closed his eyes, feeling each word like a physical blow. He had spent his entire adult life providing for this family, sacrificing his own dreams and desires to ensure they never went without. He had worked in the steel mill for 37 years, breathing in dust and chemicals that had slowly eaten away at his lungs, all so they could have better lives than he had known growing up during the Depression. The conversation in the kitchen grew more heated, voices rising with each exchange. Robert's younger brother David had apparently arrived, and his contribution to the family discussion was particularly cruel. Maybe if he had been smarter with his money instead of just working that dead-end job his whole life, we wouldn't be in this situation. Some people plan for retirement, others just expect their kids to take care of everything. Harold's hands clenched into fists on the armrests of his chair. David had been the artistic one, the dreamer who had wanted to study photography in Europe. Harold had sold his beloved 1967 Mustang, his one luxury, his pride and joy, to help fund that dream. David had spent 3 years in Paris, sending postcards but no thanks, and had returned with an expensive degree and an even more expensive sense of entitlement. "The truth is," Patricia continued, her voice growing more confident as she warmed to her theme, "we're enabling him. He sits in that chair all day, reading his books, acting like he's still the head of this household. But what does he contribute? Nothing. He's living in the past while we're struggling in the present." Margaret's voice wavered slightly as she spoke. "I know it sounds terrible, but sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had just made different choices. The house is falling apart, and we can't afford to maintain it. Maybe it would be better for everyone if we sold it and used the money to put him somewhere appropriate for his needs." The word "appropriate" hung in the air like a curse. Harold knew what it meant. He had visited those places when his own father was dying, sterile hallways that smelled of disinfectant and despair, where old people went to be forgotten by families who had grown tired of the inconvenience of love. Robert's voice cut through Harold's memories. The problem is, legally, this is still his house. We can't do anything without his cooperation, and you know how stubborn he gets about change. They were talking about him as if he were already gone, as if his presence in the next room was just another inconvenience to be managed. Harold stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and walked to the window. The garden he had tended for decades stretched before him, now overgrown and wild. He remembered teaching each of his children how to plant seeds in that soil, how to nurture growth, how to be patient with things that took time to flourish. Apparently, that lesson hadn't taken root as deeply as he had hoped. The argument in the kitchen reached a crescendo when David suggested they needed to have a serious conversation with their father about his unrealistic expectations about remaining in the house. The irony wasn't lost on Harold. The man who had built his entire life around creating a stable home for his family was now being told that his presence in that home was the problem. As the weeks passed, the tension in the house became suffocating. Conversations stopped when Harold entered a room. Bills were discussed in whispers, always with meaningful glances in his direction. His children began treating him with the kind of forced politeness usually reserved for unwelcome house guests who had overstayed their welcome. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Harold had been feeling unwell and asked Margaret to pick up an additional prescription from the pharmacy. Her response was swift and cutting. "Dad, you already take 8 different medications. Do you really need another one? These pills cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week." Robert, who had been paying bills at the kitchen table, looked up with barely concealed exasperation. "She's right, Dad. We need to start making some hard decisions about what's really necessary and what's just wishful thinking." David, who had been visiting more frequently as the family discussions about their father's future intensified, added his voice to the chorus. "Maybe it's time to accept that some things are just part of getting older. Not every ache and pain needs to be treated with expensive medicine." Harold looked at his 3 children, the same children he had rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, the same children he had cheered for at school plays and graduation ceremonies, the same children he had loved unconditionally for decades. Now they stood before him like a tribunal, weighing his worth against their convenience. "You think I'm a burden?" he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. It wasn't a question. The silence that followed was answer enough. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his eyes. Robert shuffled papers unnecessarily. David examined his fingernails with sudden, intense interest. "Dad, it's not that simple," Margaret finally said, her voice lacking conviction. "We just need to be realistic about what we can afford. Times are tough for everyone." Harold nodded slowly, as if he were seriously considering their perspective. "Times are tough," he repeated. "I understand." He paused, looking at each of their faces. "But let me ask you something. Do you remember when times were tough for me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harold continued, his voice growing stronger. "Do you remember when the mill went on strike for 6 months, and I worked construction during the day and drove a taxi at night just to keep food on the table? Do you remember when your mother got sick and I sold everything we owned to pay for her treatments?" Margaret's face flushed. "That was different. You were younger then. You had options." "Options?" Harold's laugh was bitter. "I had 3 children to feed and a mortgage to pay. My options were work or watch my family suffer. I chose work. Every single day for 37 years I chose work." Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "And we appreciate that, Dad. We really do. But appreciation doesn't change our current situation. We can't live in the past." Harold walked slowly to the old wooden desk in the corner of the room, the same desk where he had helped each of them with homework, where he had written letters to their teachers praising their achievements, where he had balanced the family budget through lean years and leaner years. He opened the bottom drawer, the one that stuck and required a special touch to open properly. From beneath a stack of old photographs and forgotten documents, he withdrew a manila folder that looked as old as the house itself. The edges were worn, and the string tie had faded from red to a dusty pink, but the contents inside were more valuable than anything his children could imagine. "You want to talk about the present?" Harold said, placing the folder on the kitchen table with deliberate care. "Let's talk about the present." His children gathered around the table, their curiosity overriding their earlier irritation. Harold untied the string with hands that suddenly seemed steadier than they had in months. The first document he pulled out was a property deed, yellowed with age but bearing official seals and signatures. 43 years ago, Harold began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, "your grandmother passed away. She left me something that I never mentioned to anyone, not even your mother." Margaret leaned forward, squinting at the faded typescript on the deed. "What is this?" 57 acres of farmland about 30 miles outside the city, Harold said simply. "Your grandmother's family had owned it for generations. When she died, it came to me. Back then, it was just empty fields and a broken-down barn. Not worth much to anyone." Robert grabbed the deed, his eyes scanning the legal description of the property. "Dad, this can't be right. This location..." He looked up, his face pale. "This is right in the middle of the new Riverside development. They've been building shopping centers and housing developments out there for the past 5 years." Harold nodded slowly. "I know, I've been watching the development very carefully. That broken-down barn, the city tore it down last month to make room for a new mall entrance. Those empty fields? The county assessor's office contacted me 6 months ago about a property tax reassessment." David snatched the folder, pulling out additional documents. Tax assessments, development notices, correspondence from real estate developers. His hands shook as he rifled through paper after paper, each one confirming what Harold was telling them. "The current assessed value," Harold said, reaching into the folder and pulling out a recent letter from the county, "is $4.7 million. The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of breathing. Margaret sank into her chair, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Robert stared at the documents spread across the table like he was looking at artifacts from an alien civilization. David's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Harold allowed the silence to stretch, watching as the reality of the situation settled over his children like a heavy blanket. The man they had dismissed as a financial burden, the father they had been planning to abandon to institutional care, was sitting on a fortune that dwarfed their combined annual incomes. $4.7 million, Margaret whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it disappear. "All this time you've been letting us argue about prescription costs and grocery bills, and you've been worth more than you ever imagined," Harold finished quietly. "More than enough to solve every financial problem this family has ever had, and enough left over to ensure that none of you ever have to worry about money again." Robert's face went through a rapid transformation, shifting from shock to embarrassment to something that looked suspiciously like calculation. "Dad, why didn't you tell us? We could have... we would never have... Would never have what?" Harold's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath the calm surface. "Would never have called me a burden? Would never have discussed putting me in a home? Would never have treated me like an unwelcome guest in my own house?" The questions hit their marks with surgical precision. Each of his children winced, as if physically struck. The weight of their recent behavior pressed down on them with the force of undeniable truth. Patricia, who had remained silent throughout the revelation, finally found her voice. "Harold, we didn't know. If we had known, if you had known, you would have treated me with respect." Harold shook his head. The problem isn't that you didn't know about the money. The problem is that you forgot who I was without it." Margaret began to cry, silent tears that spoke of shame more than sadness. "Dad, we're sorry. We were just so stressed about our own problems and we couldn't see. You couldn't see past your own selfishness," Harold said, not unkindly, but with absolute clarity. "You couldn't remember that respect isn't something you give to people based on their bank account. It's something you give to people because they're human beings, because they matter, because they've earned it through years of love and sacrifice." David cleared his throat, his voice small and uncertain. "What? What are you going to do?" "With the land, I mean." Harold folded his hands carefully and looked at each of his children in turn. "I've been thinking about that question for months, actually. Ever since I realized what this family had become, I've been wondering what I should do with this unexpected gift." He reached into the folder one final time and pulled out a sheaf of papers covered with architectural drawings and legal documents. "I've been working with a lawyer and a development company to create something meaningful. Something that would honor your mother's memory and serve a purpose greater than just accumulating wealth." The architectural drawings showed plans for a residential community designed specifically for senior citizens. Not a nursing home or assisted living facility, but actual houses where elderly people could live independently while having access to medical care, social activities, and support services. "The Harold and Eleanor Morrison Senior Living Community," he said, pointing to the title block on the drawings. "Affordable housing for seniors who have been forgotten by their families or who simply can't afford the outrageous costs of existing facilities. The land will be donated, and the rental income will be used to subsidize living costs for residents who need financial assistance." Margaret looked at the drawings with growing horror. "Dad, you can't just give away $4 million. Think about your grandchildren's education. Think about our mortgages. Think about what?" Harold interrupted. "Think about rewarding the people who spent months treating me like garbage. Think about enabling the same selfishness and entitlement that led us to this moment." Robert stood up abruptly, his businessman's instincts kicking in. "Dad, be reasonable. This is a family decision. We should all sit down and discuss the best way to handle this windfall. There are tax implications, investment opportunities, estate planning considerations." Harold's laugh was sharp and bitter. "A family decision? For months you've been making family decisions about my future without consulting me. You've been planning my life, my living arrangements, my medical care, all while treating me like an inconvenience. Now suddenly you want to be consulted." The truth of his words settled over the room like a toxic cloud. His children exchanged glances, each hoping someone else would find the magic words that could undo months of callous treatment and somehow restore their father's trust. Patricia tried a different approach, her voice taking on the wheedling tone she used with her own children when she wanted something. "Harold, honey, we made mistakes. We all did. But families forgive each other. That's what families do. And this money, it could bring us all together. We could travel, we could pay off debts, we could really be a family again. We could be a family again," Harold repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "Tell me, Patricia, what kind of family do you think we could be? The kind where love is conditional on wealth, the kind where respect has to be purchased, the kind where an old man's value is measured by his ability to solve other people's financial problems." His questions hung in the air unanswered because they were, fundamentally, unanswerable. The kind of family Patricia was describing, the kind his children wanted, wasn't a family at all. It was a business arrangement dressed up in the language of love. David, perhaps sensing the conversation slipping away from them, made one last, desperate attempt. "Dad, please, we know we messed up. We know we hurt you. But give us a chance to make it right. Don't let our mistakes destroy this family." Harold looked at his youngest son, The boy he had sacrificed his car to send to art school, the boy whose dreams he had funded even when he couldn't afford his own, and felt a deep sadness settle in his chest. "David," he said softly, "this family was destroyed the moment you all decided that my worth was measured by my ability to contribute to your bank accounts. I didn't destroy this family. I just stopped pretending it still existed." The finality in his voice was unmistakable. His children stood around the kitchen table, surrounded by documents that represented more money than they had ever imagined, and realized that their greed had cost them something far more valuable than any inheritance. Harold gathered the papers carefully, returning them to their manila folder. "The lawyers tell me that construction can begin in the spring. By this time next year, there will be homes for 60 families of senior citizens who deserve better than what I've been getting from my own children." Margaret made one final plea, her voice breaking with desperation. "Dad, please don't do this. We're family. We love you." Harold paused at the kitchen doorway and turned back to look at the three people who had once been the center of his universe. "Love isn't something you claim, Margaret. It's something you demonstrate. And for months, the three of you have been demonstrating something else entirely." As he walked slowly toward his chair by the window, Harold heard the sound of his children's voices rising in agitated discussion behind him. They were probably trying to figure out if there was any legal way to challenge his decision, any loophole that might restore their access to the fortune they had discovered too late. But Harold wasn't thinking about money or legal battles or family drama. He was thinking about Eleanor, the wife who had died too young, but who had somehow managed to leave him with the means to create something beautiful in her memory. He was thinking about the seniors who would soon have safe, affordable homes instead of institutional warehouses. He was thinking about dignity, respect, and the kind of legacy that actually mattered. Outside his window, the overgrown garden swayed in the autumn breeze, and Harold smiled for the first time in months. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money. It's the wisdom to know what truly matters, and the courage to act on that knowledge. The next morning, his children were notably absent from the kitchen table. Harold made his own coffee, took his medications without discussion, and called his lawyer to finalize the paperwork that would transform 57 acres of farmland into a community where elderly people could live with dignity. He'd spent his entire life taking care of his family. Now, finally, he was free to take care of people who would actually appreciate his care. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the elderly people in your own life who deserve better treatment, then please hit that subscribe button and join the Top Life Stories family. Because the most powerful stories aren't about money or success. They're about human dignity, respect, and the courage to stand up for what's right, no matter how much it costs. Subscribe now, and let's explore more stories that remind us what really matters in life.